Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here at the Miller Art Museum on our rescheduled presentation day here for Dan and Nancy. We're just thrilled to have them here speaking in conjunction with our Wildlife Biennial, which will be on display through the end of the month, December 30th. So if you have friends and family here for the holidays, I would encourage you to bring them to see the show. So with that, Nancy Aten and Dan Collins, our guests today, form the award-winning Landscapes of Place, an ecological restoration and conservation planning firm with projects in Wisconsin, Michigan, and New York. Nancy is a printmaker whose monotypes are inevitably about natural places she knows or wild places she hopes to restore, telling the stories of her ecological restoration practice. Dan creates monotype prints and works in wire and stone that are inspired by exuberance, grace, and raw beauty of Door County's natural places. We're thrilled to welcome Dan and Nancy here today for ReMeandering.
Thanks so much, Beth, and welcome everyone to a talk about the intersection of art and science in our lives and our work. We're really grateful to the Miller Art Museum for showing our work in the fantastic Wildlife Biennial this year. Just really an amazing show. We're also grateful to Crossroads at Big Creek, who has been giving us the opportunity to do ecological restoration work there. For us, our printmaking and our ecological restoration work are kind of always intertwined and inseparable. When we are in boots in a wetland, we have ideas for telling stories in printmaking. When we're printmaking, we see details that make us think about habitats and restoration differently. Next. On behalf of Crossroads, we want to first acknowledge the First Nations people of Wisconsin, the original inhabitants of this area, with ancient historical and spiritual connections to the land that Miller Art Museum and Crossroads at Big Creek reside upon. And in 2020, I want to note that the Crossroads Board of Directors affirmed that, quote, it believes that Black Lives Matter, is committed to addressing diversity, understands a call to reflection, and more importantly, a call to action. Proud of Crossroads' mission to inspire environmental stewardship in learners of all ages and backgrounds through education, research, and outdoor experiences, and working every day to further that goal, end quote.
We want to talk a little bit about our restoration and our conservation work, particularly our work at Crossroads at Big Creek, where we're transforming the existing conditions towards habitats that are more resilient. Crossroads has more than 200 acres as a patchwork of lands that form a variety from the pristine and high quality to the highly degraded. They're meadows, forests, fields, and a vibrant place of life and wildlife for both the people that volunteer there and the stakeholders that are the cranes and the critters that live there.
We're going to talk about this intersection of ecology and art in our lives. We're going to start with a little bit of science. A couple of definitions about ecology. First, the study of ecology is really the study of interactions between living things and between living things and their environment. And this idea of community, of ecological community as an assemblage of plants and animals that have co-evolved together for thousands of years, typically, in a particular environment, like a northern mesic forest or like a sedge meadow. And these things together form the idea of ecosystem.
We're on a long meander restoring the lands at Crossroads. Over time, these lands have been altered. In pre-settlement, these areas were probably northern mesic forest, northern wet mesic forest or sedge meadows. Mesic meaning a place that's at some form of balance of moisture. So we're at either balanced or tipping toward the wet side of the lands there. Big Creek was in the photo below shoved around. It first was a floodplain forest, and then it got pushed right, left, and center. It got straightened. It got finally, as they say in our profession, re-meandered, which becomes the touchstone word for an upcoming show that you'll have to pay attention to. The core definition of ecological restoration is as a process, an incremental process over time, assisting the recovery. That means the healing of lands, assisting that recovery of ecosystems that have been degraded, destroyed, or in other ways, a process of mending.
On the left, you see an aerial photo of Crossroads main campus, 120 acres. This was historically part of a large swamp extending from Big Creek to the west across the present highway, a big cedar swamp, no doubt. The aerial is shaded in blue with small portions that are recognized today as wetland. In this image, you can definitely see a patchwork. There's mending in progress for sure, but it shows a lot of repairs that are needed. Rectangular shapes of cleared land, of old orchards, old meadows, old pastures, disconnected parts of the stream, definitely reduced wetland conditions, sharp edges, and discontinuities. When we think about ecological restoration, there's a drawing on the right that shows some of our goals visually, these restoration goals that will be years or decades in the making. Replanting, connecting fragmented remnants of forest, softening edges, connecting and extending the creek's wetland system. This is really a kind of mending, bit by bit over time. This became the inspiration for a series of monotypes by me called Visible and Invisible Mending. Yeah. Back to the last slide. Oops.
What are
the red shapes, the swaths across those are the reddish peach with yellow edges shapes are swaths across the meadows of Crossroads, where we are focusing some of our initial diversification activities in the meadows. And we're approaching this meadow restoration as incrementally inserting diversity plantings into those meadows, and that's what those are representing.
And so each of the colors represent a different kind of plant community,
Habitat type.
different habitat type that we create for the trajectory, for the endpoint that we consider for that zone.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was interested in this idea of mending, of repairing the landscape as a metaphor, and relating to printing too as well. This idea that there is a patchwork of disjoint areas of land that need kind of stitching together to make them stronger as a whole. And I was also reading about the Japanese arts of beautiful repairs, kintsugi and sashiko, whose philosophy is that that revealing the repair, that the repair itself is beautiful, and revealing the repair is an important part of the story. So that's me trying out some stitching methods from my childhood embroidery onto paper at left, and a finished monotype at right that incorporates the stitching, as well as shinkole, which is a layering process of thin papers used in printmaking. That was just a little preview of art, but we're going to finish talking about ecology first. Next one, Marie. Just a little bit of background about the place in which we live. Crossroads, of course, is in the very heart of Door County. Door County, as we all know, is an ecologically unique biotic refuge. It has 300 miles of Lake Michigan shoreline, the massive geological presence of the Niagara Escarpment running its length. And Door County supports an abundance of significant, irreplaceable natural landscapes with distinct microclimates and rare plants and animals. Nina Leopold Bradley wrote of, quote, the uncommon natural wonders that are the precious heritage of Door County. The diversity of the local ecosystems is a result of their relatively large sizes, undisturbed nature, and connections with each other, end quote. Well, Crossroads forms a really important ecological connection in that matrix.
A bit of historical context, the drawing on the left shows the 1835 survey map overlaid on the current map. That 1835 survey done by the Government Land Office shows the shaded areas in green with a vast forested swamp at that time. The survey crew noted hemlocks and cedars. At the right, we have a soils map that shows the current soils of the Crossroads area. The blue, green, gray colors all show wetland soils. And one of the things that's interesting is that the soils remember. You can change what's on top, but underneath the soils remember what they were.
And there's a larger context to what we're doing at Big Creek too. The Big Creek Crossroads in total is about 200 acres, and those 200 acres are shown as those tiny patches at the bottom of these maps. But the Big Creek watershed is what's shaded in green and red. The Big Creek watershed is 6,000 to 9,000 acres. All of that water is headed our way at Crossroads from within those green and red shaded areas. And in addition, our karst landscape, that porous, limestony, bedrock near to the surface landscape that we live in, has sinkholes and other groundwater conduits. Those are shown in blue and red X's on the map at the left, that have an impact, a big impact on the water reaching Big Creek as well.
We have some general guiding principles we'd like to share with you for the framework for our restoration. One of the first of the principles was begin at the creek. It sort of was a natural place of energy and connection and conduit. So one of our mantras is for the restoration is begin at the creek. We also say think like a creek, or think like wildlife. Is the action that we're considering good for the fish? Is it good for the migrating birds? Is it good for the macroinvertebrates?
Also, we know that our restoration work should tell stories. The restoration should be a storyteller itself. So for example, planting a grove of spring blooming small native trees tells the story of those spring blossoms bringing the first spring insects that are so crucial to feeding the baby birds in the nests being raised. And our restoration work should also show the mending, essentially reveal the process that's going on, so that restoration can be a vicarious activity that everyone can see and participate in and understand. So we use visible blue tree tubes for all of the trees and shrubs that we're planting. We have visible work crews every Saturday morning and during the week. So we want to reveal both the repairs being done and the helping hands making those repairs.
We try to take no steps that are too frustrating. We note the tipping points and we try and cross those tipping points. And we make room for creative experimentation and to learn from mistakes.
Just a couple of details about the ecological restoration plan. This is a map of the overall target communities. In other words, where we want to head. These are based on soil types, on hydrology, on existing vegetation, and on the goal of creating increasingly self-sustaining habitats. They include in this map in green and bluish green shaded areas, some forest and wetland types. For example, northern mesic forest, also called northern hardwood forest. This is the most common native plant community in Door County, and it would have historically covered a large part of Crossroads. Mesic just means an environment with a medium amount of moisture. This forest type is thus a major portion of the long-term restoration goals. Big Creek and its wetlands ecologically need a substantial forest buffer, much bigger than the current narrow forested buffer that it has. And then Sedge Meadow, which is there are examples of each of these in the photos at the left. Sedge Meadow is a mostly open, sunny wetland. At Crossroads, they are bisected by Big Creek, and they dominate the upper parts of the stream, especially near Michigan Street. Shrub Carr is the transitional dense shrubland community that adjoins the creek and its wetlands. And then northern wet mesic forest, which we here in Door County call white cedar swamp, of course, dominated by white cedars in Door County. These riparian, meaning water-related, wetland and forest transitions are complex. There are no distinct lines between them. And then small meadows in the yellowish color are interspersed.
We consider wildlife to be an important ambassador to these lands, and they become, in ways, motivations for our restoration. Here at the Miller, we're surrounded by our wildlife biennium, and all of the artwork here creates connections between us as humans and our friends that might have fur or feathers. And we recognize that this is a powerful and important connection that we have with the land, is the wildlife we find on it. So we pay close attention to the joyous wildlife we find at Crossroads, be it an insect or a bird or a mammal.
These images are all wildlife that has been documented by people at Crossroads, by community scientists. We're always thinking in the planning about the benefits to wildlife, keeping standing snags, the importance of fallen woody debris, the fact that young successional forests, young forests growing are really a crucial habitat that's also needed by certain birds like the gold-winged warbler. Next.
An important part of this restoration is the human community that's involved. The white shapes and squiggles in the map on the left represent all of our different work zones. This year, we planted over 2,400 trees. Savannah, one of our interns, is marking our tree thermometer with the update from that day's planting. So over 2,400 trees and shrubs and more than 3,400 wildflowers and grasses were planted.
For some of this planting, we were able to recruit the help of Cream City Conservation and Consulting from Milwaukee. They are helping us to learn about implementing ecological restoration effectively while being inclusive. Their mission is to change the face of conservation. And I just want to note that restoration, remember, is a process. It is an act. It's an act done by people for the benefit of the land and wildlife. So restoration is really an expression of hope and of community.
So the connection of the artistic process to the ecological restoration, we've mentioned the metaphor of mending as one of the connections between the science of conservation and the artistic process. We want to show you a few more connections. Nancy and I both started as electrical engineers, and so the idea of equations and formulas and graphs are familiar to us to describe complex systems. And indeed, ecology is a very complex system. And as a result, mathematics and statistics are often used to describe those communities. The result is that a lot of people sometimes find the science unapproachable. And we discover and remember that art is really just another conduit to a deeper understanding, and in many ways, a more powerful, more resilient understanding of ecology.
This image is both art in its way and ecology. The art is the ash trees holding out their arms to welcome the bunches of invasive exotic reed canary grass that we're pulling from this wetland. Ecologically, the roots of this invasive grass must be gotten out of the water, and the branches are a convenient holding place. But the ecological story is really deeper, because once those grasses dry and die and are inert, months later, they weaken and slide back into the water, where they help again in this wetland, because this wetland is getting too many nutrients from upstream farms in its watershed. And those decaying grasses in the water help manage the nutrients and keep the algae down, because the microbes that digest and release or unfix the nitrogen need carbon, which comes from the decaying reed canary grass. The plants here are our teachers. So you can remember this idea by recalling this installation, or you could remember it by the formula of nitrogen unfixing.
We call that prior slide the installation. Every year, Nancy and I and others work to build what one of our friends called the installation. And for us, it became this dynamic sculpture of represented our work, and it helped us to remember this very important connection that the carbon is needed. Now, another way to remember this is by looking at the formula. And the formula is meaningful, probably not even to a half a dozen or a dozen people in Door County. Last night in preparing for this talk, I looked up the lower right-hand corner, talks about the Krebs cycle, which is in and of itself a 10-step cycle of chemistry. And the entire equation is just horrifically daunting. And if you understood it, you would know that you needed the carbon that's hung in the trees to help with the ecology, but we prefer the installation.
Next. I think Helen, it was that spoke or wrote most poetically that we are connecting the science of conservation with artistic process. And in that work, I would say we are somewhere along the spectrum of paying more attention, the work on the left, to storytelling and idea sharing, the work on the right. On the left is Maya Lin's installation at Storm King Sculpture Center in New York called Wave Field. And one of the things she said is that all of her work is really about asking us to pay more attention to the land. And one of my favorite parts about this installation is the ecology working itself out. She planted a diversity of native grasses on this wave field. But Side-Oats grama, Budalua, is a dry, sunny, loving grass. And the fringes that you see on those wave fields in tan colored are all Side-Oats grama, because that's where it persisted. It likes the very tip-top, extreme, harsh edges of those fields. So the ecology of the grasses, reveals the artistic installation here. And on the right is printmaker Tyler Green, who interviewed and worked with a restorationist, Kurt Ewing, and made prints to tell the story of Kurt's ecological restoration work, another kind of storytelling.
Another artistic process that we use is the application or use of music as the inspiration for the ecological restoration plan. In this particular sequence, we're going to show you the Moldau, which is a piece of music by Smetana, is used to help enhance the design of a system that works out the hydrology, the landforms, the habitats, the walking paths, in a sort of a complex integration of all this information at a college campus.
Yeah.
This is a short video that shows Nancy and one of her mentors and friends working out a design on a particular landscape. Neither can see the other's work. The audience can watch both of them as they were working to this very same piece of music called the Moldau. The idea is that it releases them from the rigor of the design and lets them just go. And they are working out a very complex equation of hydrology, ecology, landforms, mass space, walking paths, buildings, and they're trying to create a landscape that is both responsive to humans, but also ecologically appropriate. And this is just one technique that we sometimes use to release ourselves from the white paper syndrome.
This piece of music, the Moldau means river, and it's part of a larger symphony written by Smetana called My Country.
This was a 10-minute exercise. So they had 10 minutes. They had not really started this. They were given the same underlying drawing that showed the buildings that they had to work with.
A project new to us.
So it was new to them. So it was sort of...
In front of an audience. It's only mildly stressful. And there's, well, pastels. So Daryl remembered the flourish at the end of the Moldau in that case. That's the end, yep. The larger piece, My Country, is, you know, this composer wrote a symphony about ecology, about the places in his country. And the piece called The River is particularly inspirational, but it's the experience of a river. It includes a thunderstorm arriving at the river. And it's just a really wonderful piece when you're designing in wetlands about rivers and streams for inspiration. Now we want to show you a little bit more about our work and about how it works with our ecological restoration work. So this is one of a series of monotypes that I've done that I call One Day on a Walk. And the idea here is a pretty simple one, that I go for a walk collecting leaves and materials on that walk that express that place. And then I make a monotype to remember that place, to tell the story of that place in a print for me.
This is a print from a series I call Climate Change Your Ways. It's based on the life cycle of the monarch butterflies. And so it's trying to both reflect and think about the monarchs who are uniquely and specifically dependent on the milkweeds, that they evolved very strong capacity to use those leaves that almost no other insects can use. And so just a reflection on their presence. Sometimes our inspiration for prints are exact, and sometimes they're just a general idea that aren't bound to a specific project. So this print on the right is just a feeling I have for this particular rush that's called, I think this is Path Rush. And so just a moment of reflection and then an integration of that on a print.
I do a fair amount of monotypes that are essentially bird's eye view, looking down at the land, thinking about the fragmentation and the repair of lands. And I also love making illustrative maps. So the squiggles of the planned repairs at Crossroads on the right are part of the inspiration for this mending series of monotypes. This one called Steady Interventions. So I think about the incremental steps of intervening in patches on the land as part of doing the repairs.
Sometimes the inspiration just happens to you. On a walk one day, I encountered what's called a secretive marsh bird, and this is probably the most secretive of the secretive marsh birds, the American bittern. It's almost never seen. And I happened to be tiptoeing on a boardwalk, and it was about from me to the projector before we saw each other. The American bittern will tip its head up and sway like reeds. It tries to mimic the grasses because that's its only defense. My print that I made as an inspiration was really contemplating the revealed and the not revealed. It wasn't a literal bittern, but it was how much of the world is hidden from view and how much is revealed. A little pause just to show you our process. We each have our own press. Nancy's is a Meeker McPhee press that was made by an artist and an engineer in combination at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And then my press, I actually was lucky enough to come up with parts from other equipment that I turned into a press. And so there's peace in our studio because we each have our own press.
Lucky enough and talented enough I just want you to know that, does anybody recognize on Dan's press what makes the rollers that moves the press?
If you're old enough, you might remember the old beer distributors. The cases of beer would go down to the basement, and these are the conveyors from the old beer distributors.
So it makes it a really Wisconsin press.
That's very Wisconsin.
I recently made a new series of monotypes based on the idea of natural abundance and variety in really unexpected places, in ways and in things, in some contrast to greed and uniformity. This led me to the domain I know best, botany, and the myriad ways that plants have to propagate and to succeed. So I started drawing these super large seed pods of all kinds, from knowledge, but also from imagination, opening and ripening. I drew them large to draw attention to how different they are. I started composing these in a kind of cornucopia. I used many layers of printing to help convey depth and complexity. The seed pods became their own kind of quirky that I really liked. So I started overprinting them to deepen the richness of color and draw out their graphic power. The green heron is just a super cool bird, a tool user, a smart little bird. So cool, smart, and always present to those of us restoring wetlands. The green heron is often the first thing we hear in the wetland and throughout our work. A friendly, curious little bird, kind of the icon of doing wetland restoration work, always watching us, always curious. So I called this print tool maker. Both the heron and I have some makeshift tools in the field, including a scissors for me, which is a tool I use to remove invasive seed heads. For a while, I could not stop making prints in this series, a series I called Unusual Farmer, focusing on the tools and practices of ecological restoration, particularly in wetlands. I am in boots doing botanical surveys, using soil probes, removing invasive species, planting native plants, monitoring tadpoles, salamanders, fairy shrimp, and other magical creatures of wetlands. I feel like a different sort of Wisconsin farmer. Another big series that I've made is Postcards of Hope. I made many small monotypes attached to something that someone said, a fragment in a conversation, or a sentence in an article I was reading, something that gives me hope. This particular one, we have learned to honor the muskrat who made Turtle Island possible. To quote from the creation story, Turtle Island, for the Ojibwe Anishinaabe people, quote, "So Muskrat dove into the water. He was gone much longer than any of the others who tried to reach the bottom. After a while, the other animals were certain that Muskrat had given his life trying to reach the bottom. Far below the water surface, Muskrat had in fact reached the bottom. Very weak from lack of air, he grabbed some earth in his paw and with all the energy he could muster, began to swim for the surface," end quote. And that soil was the beginning of Turtle Island, where we live. And I, as well as the eastern gray tree frog, stand for science. Climate change is not a belief system. And a wetland, like a mountain, cannot be relocated. I've used these postcards as actual postcards too, giving them away at conferences for people to write their legislators their concerns and recommendations and suggestions for climate change.
Art can help me understand the sort of ecology and the processes that exist. The layering, the complexity, the connections, the interactions, the interrelationships are all consistent and equal between the artistic process and the ecological process. So in many ways, the process has so many metaphors that are identical, and I enjoy the acknowledgement of the two, that those kinds of connections are found in both domains.
This one is called Waiting for the Melt. I spend January, actually Dan and I always have something we say to each other, how many days till we hear frogs, which is at this point, I think probably under 100 days. So when we get in the 2 digits, it's very exciting. And I spend a lot of January and February looking at the frozen wetlands and imagining the creatures that have survival techniques under the ice through the winter. And so waiting for the melt is just imagining all of the life slowly awakening below the ice and in the thawing ground.
The print at the left is called Persistence of Silphium, and the picture at the right is a December view of a prairie. The brown bits you see are brown-headed bush clover, and beyond is sort of the purpley pink of little blue stem. The bush clover and little blue stem form what's called a drift. That drift is a natural occurrence that we note and we come to like and love when we see a landscape that has something like that running through it. My print was an attempt to reveal that sort of subtle color on color, texture on texture notion of a drift that occurs in nature. With art, I find I can detach from representational light and color. And sometimes in Door County, the color is just so drop dead gorgeous that no one would believe you if you told them. And so sometimes I say, well, why not just embolden that point and run with it? So that's what this print did. And here we are with in our natural environment caught by Kelly Avenson, an accomplished local Door County photographer who was nice enough to take our photo in our natural community.
So we thank you very much, and we would be delighted to answer any questions you have about anything in the talk.
Thank you.
Oh.
Yeah.
And so what are you looking for, or what do you discover that, you know?
That's a great question. There is a lot of effort put into the science of what's called wetland delineation. And one of the centerpieces of that is the analysis of soil. And so what we do is we put a probe in the ground sometimes, which is a stick with a slit in it, and we push the probe in and we turn it and pull it out, and we get the story of the soil. Or sometimes we actually dig a narrow trench and we look for the different horizons of soil, the organic layer, the layers of clay, the layers of clay that exist where there's no oxygen, and they have different colors. They're grays, and it's really a beautiful series. Nancy, in fact, has done a series just on soils, because the soils that come out are so interesting. So the soil remembers what was there, and it's retained for centuries. So if you move a river or you move a wetland and you come back and you do a soil core, you can tell that this was likely a wetland. And so we say the soil remembers. And so when we do our restoration, we use that as a data point, because, oh, well, the soil it's the right soil. And if the hydrology is there, then that all of a sudden says that your restoration can take a trajectory to put it closer to what it was. So
I mean, the science of identifying a historical wetland that may not be obviously present anymore has these 3 parts. One is soils, one is vegetation, and the other is essentially the shape of the land, depressions, or the slope, or its relationship to a slope. Those last 2 things can change. The vegetation might not persist, the shape of the land might be different, but the soils remember for a long time. And in the United States, some of the earliest aerial photography is when the government started taking aerial photographs. The U.S. Department of Agriculture in the 1930s are usually the earliest ones, basically to identify, good farmland. But these aerial photos they were taken with big glass plate negatives from low-flying planes, and the quality is spectacular. And By the 1930s in Door County, a lot of the land had been cleared and was in agriculture, but you can see, even looking down onto the land, you can see differences in soil color that show you where streams were running, what areas were wet. You can see it in the aerial photos. When we showed you the remeandering of Big Creek at Crossroads, that the top gray picture, you can actually see that's from the 60s, I think, but you can see the soil of the original meander of the river on that map, even though it had been shoved into a straight ditch at that point in time. Yeah. Yeah.
What are the various disturbances that cause to a branch?
Oh, the question was, what are the causes of the disturbances that have made Crossroads what it looked like today, or what are the various events in its life that have changed it? And so we, the major events, Door County is not an obvious place to try and eke out an existence. And the consequence is that the early arrivals here did everything that they could that made sense. First, they would cut timber, and then they would maybe pasture or even have crops. And then later on at Crossroads, there were orchards. So the lands at Crossroads are very rectilinear, very squared off into parcels that were used for those functions. The first cuts were made, and those trees are long gone. But the subsequent use for pasture and for orchards, we see a little bit more remnants for, but those marks are still found on the land, and they become challenges for us as restorationists, because we have to pay attention to what was here originally with the benefit of the government survey done in the 1830s, and then what happened over its life, and then what can we do about it? Because you can't always put everything back to the way it was, but you can always find a happy home of sustainable ecology that's available as a trajectory. So that's
one of the historical changes at Crossroads was certainly the highway to the west of Crossroads. If you look at, I think it's called Little Creek on the west side of the highway, small little stream in town, that could very well originally have been Big Creek, because the vast wetlands of the Big Creek watershed extended to the west across the present highway. Tim. Yes, Tim is asking about Storm King in New York. Storm King is in a little town called Cornwall on the Hudson River in upstate New York. It's a sculpture garden. I've been there quite a few times. My mentor, Daryl Morrison, actually, who was the gentleman drawing in that video next to me, that's who I studied with. Daryl was hired to introduce native grasslands to the landscapes at Storm King. The original Storm King is a vast, I don't know how many thousands of acres, outdoor sculpture park, and the land around the sculptures was always farmed. And they wanted a softer sort of backdrop to these massive sculptures. And so Daryl did grassland restoration work at Storm King. And I've been there quite a few times, yeah. Yes, it is beautiful. It's a beautiful part of New York. Mm-hmm. Yes.
How did you make the transition from electrical engineering to restoration and art?
Yes, well, I am a total math geek, and so engineering was a very logical, math and science geek, a very logical choice to me for both college. It also seemed super practical as a career decision, and I loved it. I loved the math behind developing software. I worked in the field of integrated circuit design for computer chips and such. But I was also always a plant geek. as a kid, I grew up with my mom teaching me the wild plants, the native plants in the woods near where we lived. We both were kind of nature kids, and when I was approaching 40, I decided that maybe I should spend my days doing something that was closer to my passions of being outdoors. And but I thought about art as well, a second career in art as well as ecology. And I met Daryl Morrison, the same guy I've been talking about, and his work is all about merging art and ecology in landscape restoration work. And I thought, that's it. That's what I should be doing. And so I went back to school to study with him. And that's how I got there when I was about 40. And Dan?
Well, I grew up as a river rat as a kid. So I used to take my bike to the river and park it in the weeds and then spend all day there. So nature was always very close to me. And when I saw what fun Nancy was having, I slowly, over weeks and months and years, migrated that way and had the joy of being able to join her company about 15 years ago or so.
Susan.
Well, we just moved into a new place and we have a little forest of our own. And the Lily Bay Creek runs through it. And first looks like not much has happened there. And the creek is full of branches and things and other things. And I was wondering, what should we do?
Sure. There's a question about a wooded property that Lily Bay, that's on Lily Bay, or
Creek,
Lily Bay Creek. A forested property, and what can be done to restore it. And one of the things is woody debris in the creek is probably awesome. Usually that part of it is really healthy. It's one of the things that we work on in messaging at Crossroads is that messiness of creeks is what really helps them. It disperses the water flow. It helps things that are laying eggs in or near the water survive. So messiness is a good sign that you have that in your creek. Typically in Door County, forest challenges could be there. We have a few woody invasive species that can sometimes really change the character of the forest. At Crossroads, those are European buckthorn and Eurasian honeysuckle, sometimes European autumn olive. Those are usually woody shrubs that can grow in woodlands. A sign that you might have those is all of those invasive shrubs uniformly leaf out first in the spring and are the last with green leaves in the fall. So a healthy woods around here is barren of green leaves until the spring ephemerals plants start coming up on the forest floor. So if you have shrubs that are turning green sooner than that, that's probably something to pay attention to and to reduce those. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I want to kind of go back to this language that you used about the soil remembering as opposed to the soil recording.
Oh.
I think that for me, there's a difference between a scientific and an emotional thinking there. And for me, it kind of, assuming that from your perspective, the nature has like an emotional life and an intelligence that is shared by the human beings. Would you talk a little bit more about that, about the natural intelligence of both inanimate, materials and the living creatures that are there?
Yeah, I think you've hit on a really important topic. It starts with an acknowledgement of what we don't know. From the science side, we're starting to get a hint that trees communicate to each other, that there is a connection. But ethnobotanists probably have known this for millennia. And so our response to a zone could be, if it's purely scientific, we might be missing some of the color and the flavor that is there to be had. And so the emotional connection to these places is appropriate. And it's important to share that because we won't take care of things we don't know, and we won't love things that we don't know. And so helping folks to remember that, you know, the real world, we refer to it as the real world. Have you been to the real world today, we say? Because the real world is the outdoor world. I wore these like rubber, you know, shoes today because this is what I'm often found in, is something that is comfortable in the mud. And there's an emotional connection that I think we can get, and we should. It's helpful to share that notion.
I think I'm always influenced by the intelligence of. I mean, maybe it seems strange to think of the intelligence of the both biotic and abiotic world, but it is. I'm influenced, for example, by the writing of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who, when you read her, you realize that plants are way smarter than we are, and you know, she uses language of the plants as our teachers, and it's true. When I rethought about that story of the reed canary grass in the wetland, which just seemed like a practical sciencey thing to do, when I thought about it from the perspective of the plants teaching me what to do, you know, it changes it kind of deepens my relationship with the work that I'm doing, and it's an important part of it to me. Even an inanimate thing like a boulder, rocks tell fascinating stories, and it's partly the relationship of the rocks and the things growing on it, but you really understand restoration from the beginning. How does a community of plants begin on the surface of a rock? And you know, that is a deeper understanding that informs the rest of our work too. So I think it's really interesting because I hadn't really thought of saying that the soil recorded, but man, soil is full of life and so complicated that it's hard to think of soil as just a static thing. Yes.
And on the heels of that, because that's what I was thinking about, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Is the soil communicating to our trees and our other living organisms, or are those living organisms communicating to the soil? It's fascinating because we went on a hike, the Eaton Swamp, and the gentleman who led us is at Minnesota, and the thoughts that came from that walk illuminated things I was already thinking and journaling about. It's like, and of course, Rain Sweetgrass was a deep, wonderful story. But you just wonder how that all, you just, when you stand there and someone tells you this has been noted, that they talk and that they warn and that it's just, how, and you become more committed. And I have to say, from the art perspective, these two should be in the schools. For two reasons. Obviously, the art is fascinating, but as a former educator, children think that if they're good at math or science, that's it. That's it. That's what they're good at, and that's the place where they survive and they do well. But for them to be able to hear from you, the way you tap into the other hemisphere, and to use the gifts, that's just powerful. So I'm just saying, these two need to be in the schools. Even your mud stories, you know, your background, this is what I did, because those are pieces of these kids. Kids all learn with their body totally immersed. And yet that grows out of them. It did grow out of you, and look at the gifts.
Yes.
I have one more question on that. So I know that the suckerfish is a phenomenon that happens in the Big Creek, and it's really fascinating and amazing. I spent a lot of time looking at that. Are there other phenomena? I mean, that's kind of an obvious one. There's a bunch of big fish in very little water. It's very accessible. Are there other kind of natural phenomenons that are happening there that are less visible to people?
Yeah, the question is, the suckerfish is a known phenomena at Big Creek, and are there other natural phenomena that we might see or know about at Big Creek? And, you know, the short answer is that there's there's countless amounts of those phenomena. Some are known and some are not known, and some are revealed and some not. I mean, the ones that, you know, we can see are the miracle of metamorphosis and what you see in an ephemeral pond when you know, amphibians breed, and then those little wiggly critters all of a sudden at a certain point, you know, go from gill breathing to lung breathing and start growing legs and then come up on the land. Those phenomena, even though, you know, it takes weeks and months, are vibrant. And so
along those lines, the emergence of the damselflies and dragonflies in the cove at Big Creek is a cool thing to experience. Them, you know, emerging and drying their wings on blades of grass, and then being able to fly away.
When does that happen?
The larvae of the dragonflies and damselflies usually come out toward the end of June. And if you're there
into July.
Yeah, into July, if you're there at the right time, I mean, we're in wetlands a lot in Boots, and so we will know, oh, it's happening today. And so we'll pause our work. And sometimes it can take a long time for this dragonfly to emerge. It has climbed up onto a reed. It has parked itself there. It has turned crusty. The back splits open and its wings inflate with the juices inside. And then the wings get big enough. And after a half an hour, it flies away. And, you know, you've just witnessed what is the end of a fairly long cycle. Some of these have been spending years getting ready for that moment when it can fly away and start this life cycle.
Of course, some of the birds, the arrival of the sandhill cranes in the spring, hearing that call overhead and seeing them, they often are very calmly walking around at Crossroads at the cove. Can often see sandhill cranes. I always think of the noisiness of the cedar waxwings eating all of the Juneberry fruits that I'm trying to get to first. It's one of the reasons we are planting lots of Juneberries at Crossroads, because you know, cedar waxwings like know when those are ripe, and they crowd around and they're kind of, you know, chattering little birds. And I love the cedar waxwings when the Juneberry fruits are ripe.
There's other phenomena. The population is down a little bit, but bats are a great phenomena to be out on a cool summer night and watch them come out and feed. For their first shift of feeding, they feed twice, once early dusk and once late. And how amazing they are and efficient they are at finding the insects, and that whole notion of, and most of these phenomena will find you. You won't find them so much, but it takes a commitment to be out in the woods and to stay a little while and to sit a little while sometimes. So this phenomena, they're often difficult to say, I'm going to go look for this today. You won't find that one. You'll find a different one.
So I don't get very many opportunities to say that. But this summer, for the first time, I walked out, I saw Stone Harbor, the waterfront there for years. And this was the first time that I saw, there were 2 herons down there, and I also saw an egret, and I just thought that's so unusual. And and they were really fairly undisturbed by the boats. You know, it's so surprising.
Yeah.
Is that a good sign, or is that a bad sign? They're not finding what they need, so they're getting closer to coming back into the city?
So the question is, you know, seeing egrets and herons in sort of the more city settings, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And you know, it is both. You've really landed on an important theme. The egrets are probably nesting over at Green Island, and they're coming over here to feed, and they load up their bellies and fly all over. You know, they fish all day, fly back all day, and then, you know, they have to regurgitate their food for their young, and then they do it all over again the next day. It's a horrible existence, I think. But you know, they don't. The good news is that they're breeding there and that they are vibrant. The bad news is they probably, you know, have a preferential place, and the middle of Sturgeon Bay probably isn't it. But you know, so it's a balance. It's like, are we in balance or out of balance? one thing I will say in this regard, if it weren't for the crisis of climate, I would be beating the drum for the crisis of habitat, because we are all sort of immune to this idea that our roads are expanding, our everything is expanding, and all this is at the detriment of habitat. And the habitat crisis is big and real, and it's related to the climate crisis, but we are at a dearth of the amounts of habitats that we had when we arrived at this place as a young person, and we continue on that slope. And so, you know, that's a whole other talk.
You know, in Sturgeon Bay, where there are areas where the land meets the water without a
Transition.
what do you call sheet
Sheet wall.
sheet wall. You know, where there are opportunities for native rushes and reeds to be planted in those zones, that really helps habitat for the little things that the herons and the egrets want to eat. And so, you know, that's a way that we could make Sturgeon Bay more hospitable to those birds searching for food. And there are those opportunities both in private landowners along areas of Sturgeon Bay, and in some of Sturgeon Bay's own parks and lands have those opportunities too. And that's something that could help them out, give them better habitat to forage in. Mark. Right.
What was there 100 years ago may not be there in the next.
Right. The question is, how are we addressing climate change in the restoration work at Crossroads? And there are a few specific strategies we're taking. One is in some of the transitions to forest, shrubland transitions to forest, a lot of the shrubland and young trees in that have pretty wide geographic range to our south. So as the climate changes, that early successional process, we are specifically using shrubs and trees that have a wide range to the south to basically give them a better chance as the conditions around them may change. If things become drier, for example, that will help in that transition to forest. We are introducing more woody debris into Big Creek. Big Creek is actually really lucky as a creek because it has, topographically speaking, its flood terrace, the level of land near it that is supposed to absorb all the extra water and replenish the creek is largely intact. But in more extreme weather events, you get, you know, huge downpours in June or in the spring. And you really do not want that water to go rushing down Big Creek. You want it to settle into the flood terrace and be absorbed by the plants. And so we are doing things in Big Creek itself to let that water divert into the flood terrace. We are also trying to pack diversity into the meadows. We're basically there. So there are two main concepts with dealing with change like climate change. That in an ecological community, there's resistance and there's resilience. And the idea of adding diversity into the meadows is basically hedging our bets. We're trying to make those meadows as resilient as possible for changes that we don't exactly know what will be. So diversity is often a big tool to use to give a system more resilience. We are also in the utility line, the power line cut that goes across Crossroads that exposes the creek there to sunny conditions that raise its temperature, which is very hard on the life in the creek. We can't plant trees in the power line corridor, but we are planting dense shrubs to help shade the creek in that zone, to help the continuity of Big Creek and the things that the insects and macroinvertebrates and other life that is trying to live in the creek, to help those survive. So we're trying to shade the creek where it crosses the utility corridor. Those are some of the strategies.
And are we getting up to our, okay,
Can I ask you one last question?
Yes.
yeah, absolutely. We're here, yeah.
As a person who maybe doesn't have an extensive background, so like a novice to conservation, as somebody who wants to be involved, are there possibilities for people to show up and help or interact in a different way that you could suggest?
That is a fantastic question. We can answer it just, the question is how can one help in this process of healing the earth? So many opportunities, but I'll start with Crossroads, which has a group called Habitat Healers of volunteers who meet on, there's a little hiatus right now in the winter, but meet on Saturday mornings at 9:30 to 11:30 at Crossroads every Saturday. It will probably start up again in March or April. There we will be planting native trees and shrubs and plugs and doing some invasive species control and other work. I know the Door County Land Trust also has numerous opportunities to help on land trust preserves throughout the county doing similar kinds of activities.
And on a bigger scale, there are groups that you can join that start where you are. Things like Wild Ones is a native landscaping club that really welcomes people just starting wherever you are and helps you sort of grow your knowledge base and your interest in native plants and native landscaping.
There are also a lot of fun and really approachable books to read. There are the books by Robin Wall Kimmerer. There are the books by Doug Ptolemy, who talks about the relationship between birds and insects and native plants that are really fascinating to read. And maybe other people have book suggestions too, but.
And attending an art show like we have here at the Miller is a great
The
way.
Wildlife Biennial.
We can.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Dan and Nancy, how lucky we are in Dark County here to have them as part of our community. Just wonderful resources, and Crossroads at Big Creek and Miller Art Museum. So thank you all for coming today to listen, to support our work. We appreciate it. Happy holidays. Thank you.